In this section of the lecture, I want to talk about what was happening in England before the Industrial Revolution. That is the period before the middle of the 18th century. Even before that time, England had moved ahead of the pack of other countries in Europe. We've seen this graph before. It shows GDP per capita on the horizontal axis, and you can see that basically from England's the blue coloured line, you can see from 1650 England's moving sort of ahead of other countries in Europe, only on these data remaining behind the Netherlands. There's other data which put England sort of ahead of the Netherlands around that date. But whichever data we use, the important point is that by the time when the Industrial Revolution began, at least by the standards of the day and by the standards in Europe, England was a relatively well-off country. So it's worthwhile spending a little bit of time asking sort of what was happening in the English economy at this time, just before the Industrial Revolution happened, and why Britain had come to be a relatively high-wage, high-income country. I'm going to do that by looking at 4 particular topics: what was happening in agriculture, what was happening in industry, what was happening in finance and tax sphere, and what was happening in government. So first of all, agriculture. Now, the data on output, productivity in agriculture are far from perfect, but there does seem to be a reasonably consistent story which emerges, which is that, again, even before the Industrial Revolution, so 1600 to 1750, agricultural productivity in England was increasing to put it on a par with the leading productivity agricultural producers in England. This is a table which shows population indexed to 100 in 1700, agricultural output per person indexed to 100 at the same time, using 2 different demand and volume methods of calculating output. And if you look through to 1700 to 1750 to 1850, you can see that the point is that there's very large increase in population from 1700 to the end of the Industrial Revolution, over tripling, and during the same time agricultural output per person, it declines. That's per person in the population. It declines a little bit, but nowhere near as much as the large increase in population, and that's something that comes out whichever of the measures we use. So in the period sort of before the Industrial Revolution, you see population increasing and food per person increasing. In the period during the Industrial Revolution, we see a large increase in population and some decrease, but in the context of the size of the population increase, relatively steady amount of food or agricultural output per person. So this also tells us that productivity in agriculture was improving in the period before the Industrial Revolution, and then actually kept improving sort of in the period after the Industrial Revolution commenced. Where did the productivity growth in agriculture in England come from? Well, a long-standing explanation was that it was something called enclosure. So enclosure was a shift in the method of organising property in rural areas in England from thinking of property as being common to, or held in common, so that people could send their animals, for example, onto any areas of land in particular village area that they wanted to a system where land, for example, was fenced, and where it was more a system that individual families or farmers would have the rights, exclusive rights, to manage and farm a particular area of land. And the argument went that that shift from common property to private property would increase productivity by, for example, giving incentives to better manage, better farm the land. So if you know that improvements to land you make are all going to be captured by you in the output you produce, if you know that someone else's cattle can't come and trample over your crop, then it gives you more incentive to invest in your farm. So the long-standing argument was that enclosure was a source of productivity improvement. Now seems generally accepted that that's not so much the case. That, for example, it seems that even before enclosure, there were systems of organising property in place so that land was regarded as being, particular land in a village was regarded as being mainly the property, or particular families had the right to farm that piece of land. And it was only common, that there were limited common areas which were mainly sort of waste lands. So we now think that the shift from before enclosure to after enclosure didn't change the way land was used as much as been previously thought. Also, enclosure was quite expensive. The cost of fencing, the cost of building roads and drainage have to be offset against other benefits of the enclosure system. Instead, it seems that the reason for increase in productivity growth has probably got more to do with an increase in land under cultivation. So from 1700 to 1850, the amount of land under cultivation in Britain increased from 11 million acres to 14.6 million acres. And the other factor is that the land under cultivation was made more productive. So a shift from 3-crop rotation to 4-crop rotation, and the introduction of new crops such as clover and turnips meant that land could be used for crop growing more continuously. The new types of crops, clover, turnips, meant that added nitrogen into the soil that made the soil more productive. The greater amount of, for example, feed for animals by the land being made more productive meant that the animals created more manure, which fertilised the soil more. So there was a virtuous circle in terms of soil quality. So through the crop rotation system and the types of crops, new crops that were grown, it seems like soil fertility increased because of the increased amount of nitrogen that was in the soil, and that increased agricultural productivity. This growth in agricultural productivity was important in two ways. First of all, depending on what measure you use, 30 to 45% of the British economy was agriculture before the Industrial Revolution. So improvements in productivity in agriculture had important effects on the overall productivity of the economy. Also, the Industrial Revolution means an increasing proportion of workers in industry. So that is, in effect, you're taking workers out of agriculture and putting them into industry. But obviously you have the same amount of people to feed. And so that means either you need to be getting more food imports from overseas, or you need to be raising the productivity in agriculture so that you can have a lesser number of workers feeding the same number of population, or in the case of England, actually growing population, but a smaller share of the population growing food to feed the rest of the population. So this productivity growth in agriculture was important for living standards at the time, but also an important underpinning to the Industrial Revolution, which was to occur. The second area I want to look at is industry in England. Industry in England didn't begin with the Industrial Revolution. By 1750, already about 35% of output or workers were in manufacturing industry in England. Following the Black Death, there'd been an increasing amount of land available for raising sheep and growing wool, and there'd been, or high quality land available, and so there'd been an increase in the thickness and length of wool. This improvement in the quality of wool meant that British woolen textile manufacturers could start to grow the new lighter type of wool, new draperies, which had become popular with consumers. And so Britain ends up becoming the world's leading manufacturer of these textiles, displacing Belgium and Italy, who had been previously the main manufacturers. In the middle of the 17th century, 2/3 of British exports are of textile products. There are other examples of technological advance during this period. For example, in particular, it seems like there was significant improvement in military technology, but other types of examples as well, from wire drawing machines through to butter churns. An example of the industrialisation in England at the time is the patterns of regional specialisation that were starting to develop. So you had metalware in Birmingham, flatware in Sheffield, pottery in Staffordshire, and coal being produced in Wales and Newcastle. And London, partly as a result of the increased amount of international trade, was emerging as a commercial centre where employment activities based around the port and based around the financial sector were accounting for an increasing proportion of economic activity. It's also important to mention in this period the putting out system, which was an important intermediate step between the previous sort of small-scale guild system of production of industrial goods and what would come in the Industrial Revolution, which was the factory system. The putting out system was where entrepreneurs would take raw materials to the homes of workers who would then undertake the manufacturing activity in their home. And the putting out system was commonly used for things like spinning and weaving and basket and broom manufacture. And it was especially important in rural areas where the seasonal labour demand for agriculture meant that our households often had an amount of spare time that they could devote to this activity. And it also meant that the putting out system could avoid some of the restrictions that might otherwise have existed due to the guild system which existed in more urban areas. The third area I want to talk about is development in finance, both private finance through capital markets and government finance through taxation. The growing international trade and the wars that Britain was more or less continuously involved in through to the middle of the 18th century created a large demand for finance, to finance trade voyages, to finance warfare, and for financial instruments. Interestingly, the finance wasn't sought so much directly as a source of paying for manufacturing fixed capital, as it seems that a lot of industry investment was in fact paid for from self-finance or retained earnings. In the lead up to the Industrial Revolution, capital markets increasingly developed and became more sophisticated in England. So England had copied and further developed and refined the Dutch model of the joint stock company and provision of limited liability to shareholders as a method of financing trading ventures. The Bank of England was created in 1694, which also became an important part of English capital markets. With regard to the government sector, it seems that by the 18th century, the British system for raising tax revenue was relatively effective and efficient. It had a relatively broad tax base and there was effective collection by public officials. And Britain was also relatively advanced in its creation of public finance instruments such as, through the bond market, the famous British consols. This graph shows the share of national income that was taken as tax by the government, and you can see how that share after sort of the late 17th century grows from about 4% up to 12% at the time of the Industrial Revolution commencing. So Britain had a relatively effective and efficient method for financing government activity. The fourth area before the Industrial Revolution that I want to talk about is government activity more generally. This is a graph that for a variety of countries in Europe from the 12th through to the 18th century shows an index of parliamentary activity. So it's an index that is based on the frequency of Parliament meeting, and it's supposed to proxy for the role that parliaments had in influencing policy making in those societies. And you can see, if you look, England is the blue again, that by about the 15th century in England compared to other countries in Europe, the Parliament was relatively influential if we take this activity index as a measure of influence. You can also see how the index increases sort of in the 17th and 18th century, and in particular after the Glorious Revolution of 1688. that's a pattern that's consistent with historical accounts that see the Glorious Revolution of 1688 as being a very important event in increasing the role of parliamentary democracy in England and putting constraints on the degree of power of the king. Because in this period of history, we're really talking about, in terms of the power for policy making, the issue of the relative balance between the influence of kings or royalty and the parliament. And so the story here is that amongst other countries in Europe, the parliament had come by the time of the Industrial Revolution to be relatively influential in England. Okay, so what did all this mean for Britain generally? Well, we've seen at the start that it meant that Britain was a relatively high-wage economy. There's usually sort of two explanations given for why Britain was a high-wage economy. One of them is what's referred to as a Malthusian explanation. This is the idea that the reason Britain had high wages or high income per capita is that they had a relatively high death rate and low birth rate. So in terms of the Malthusian trade-off that I talked about earlier in this lecture, Britain was choosing to have a lower population in order to have a higher standard of living or higher income per capita. The reason the birth rate was lower in Britain than other parts of Europe was, or one reason that's often given, is that there were significant employment opportunities for young women to work in the rural sector, for example, within the household as servants. And so that, it's argued, delayed marriage in Britain compared to other parts of Europe. The high death rate seems to be explained partly by high levels of urbanisation in Britain compared to other parts of Europe. So, for example, if you were in London at this time, your life expectancy was 27 years. It's also explained by Britain being involved so extensively in trade and warfare, which were a major way in which epidemic diseases were spread. The other explanation for Britain as being a high-wage economy is the idea that workers in Britain were more productive. That, for example, through technological advances, through Britain's methods of producing textiles, that industrial workers in Britain were relatively productive, that once industrial workers became relatively productive, that increased the pressure for productivity improvements to occur in the agricultural sector, and that this process of productivity improvement as well was intensified by Britain becoming increasingly involved in international trade, which allowed them to specialise more in industry in which they had, which was their comparative advantage at the time, which also boosted worker productivity. So Britain was a high wage economy, and that seems to have led to Britain also being what we'd regard as a consumer society. So by a consumer society we mean a society where consumers had incomes that were sufficiently high for them to be affording to buy an increasing range of goods that we'd regard as consumer goods. So Jan de Vries, for example, points out that at the end of the 17th century, looking at probate records in England, only 10% of the general population for whom the probate records are available are recorded as having died with timepieces. Yet by the end of the 18th century, if you look just at pauper records, 40% of the paupers were recorded as having died with timepieces. So the story here is of Britain becoming an economy where there was an increasing capacity to afford to buy consumer goods and where there was an increasing range of these goods available. So that's what was happening in Britain before the Industrial Revolution. In the next lecture we're going to move on and look at the Industrial Revolution.